Welcome to Ananta's Well, the Sacred Thresholds podcast. Together, let's explore all the liminal, in-between places we can know. Birth, death, peak states, flow states, rites of passage, initiation, aging and coming of age, pain, trauma, finding your dharma in the world, prayer, meditation, invocation, spiritual growth, and anything under the sun which invokes a new level of consciousness. Let's dive in. Die to live. Bodhisattvas and Aghora, Death as Initiator, a Samhain special. Throughout my life, death has been no stranger. I was introduced to death as initiator at a very young age, my parents dying in the AIDS epidemic in Seattle when I was 2 and 3 years old. In a way, death has always walked with me, just out of sight, but never out of mind. In the past year or two, I've had this distinct feeling of being over the hill and moving toward the side that begins chugging its way toward death. It may be indeed that I'm entering the second half of my life, or I could die tomorrow. No one ever knows, right? At the same time, as a longtime veteran of chronic illness, I've contemplated my own death in vivid detail. Sometimes in despair, sometimes in a mere pondering of whether this illness would eventually take me, and sometimes just imagining myself, after a long life, dying in my own terms in samadhi. I've had a recent scare even which sent me into a bit of a reverie about my own potential demise, and I can only say I don't know. I'm not willing to do further testing right now while I nurse my baby, and so I focus on my own healing once again from the holistic point of view. Yet, it is an invitation for me to again take inventory of my life and find razor-sharp focus on the things which truly matter most. What do I intend to do with the remainder of my life? What is really not worthy of my time anymore? What do I care most about as my legacy to my children and the world? I've also been long partnered with a man much older than me, the father of 3 of my children, who's had his... And so my contemplation of loss has taken on new layers, the potential inevitability of losing him too soon, along with the remnants of my own history of losing people too soon. I share this all not to open on a morbid note, but to speak of the relevancy of death in my life, and so many of us share similar or different stories which bond us in the beautiful but fleeting and sometimes rather fragile hold that we have on life. But what is life, and what is death? My perspective on this may differ than some, or simply hold a light to our existence in a way which may not completely nullify the tragedy of death, but still makes room for more. More of what? Let's dive in to Ananta's Well. I spend a fair bit of time these days reading people's stories of near-death experiences and past life memories in various groups on Facebook. I find them comforting and also revelatory in nature, some of them speaking to the same sentiments I have about death. Death is, to the well-ordered mind, nothing but the next great adventure, says Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings. I feel the weight of that statement in a twofold manner. On one hand, of course, it is comforting, but on the other, it is only comforting if we are of the well-ordered mind ilk. And the question is, are you? Or how do you get there? And is death meant to become a cosmic joke to the well-ordered mind? Is grief no longer in the vocabulary of such an enlightened soul? I often contemplate this very thought as I myself walk this walk of the Bodhisattva, consciously aware of the ways in which I have even intentionally allowed myself to be taken by the illusion of this world, while also aware that I am just one well-ordered breath away from total enlightenment. I don't say this to be spiritually egotistical, only to say that when you've walked this razor's edge of consciousness for many lifetimes, remembering past lives, cultivating spiritual awareness and gifts, and also choosing to return time and time again to further your learning and find deeper and deeper wells of compassion and capability, enlightenment no longer serves as the ultimate goal, but rather service does. This is largely why I have been drawn to the Eastern traditions such as Buddhism and Hinduism, and specifically Gaudiya Vaishnavism, the Krishna-worshipping tradition of Vedanta, which speaks to this concept of the Bodhisattva in a different twist. At least, that's my take on it. To the Vaishnava, one may aspire to reach Krishna's realm in the highest of heavens. But the highest and most perfect aspiration of the true bhakti yogi, the yoga of devotion, is to hope instead to almost reach Krishna, to taste that union, but to choose to return instead to serve God in any realm, even the hell realms, consciously choosing to go to any depth necessary to assist other souls on the path. Sounds a lot like a bodhisattva to me. In his book Aghora, Robert Svoboda spoke of the poet Kalidasa, who had worshipped her, Ma, the same way for lifetimes, but then was born as a mentally handicapped man and unable to worship. One day the king sent for him, as his daughter refused to marry anyone who couldn't outsmart her, and to prove a point, he sent for the stupidest man in the region. He forced his daughter to marry him, and on their wedding night she rejected him for his stupidity. It was then that he ran to the temple and banged his head in frustration on the murti of Ma, just as he had done for lifetimes prior, and she came to him and asked him to let her in. But he was afraid, and so he only stuck his tongue through the door, at which she showed him his previous lives and gave him the gift of divine speech. He became a great poet and won the heart of his princess and lived a long and happy life in the lap of Ma, while also a householder. Svoboda says, Ma wanted him to live for a while in the world and provide us with his sublime poetry. Suppose he had realized her right away. Would he have had the idea to get married and have a householder's life? Never. The bliss of living with Ma is billions of times greater than all mundane pleasures. She wanted to entangle him partially in her Maya, and then to save him, so that while he was working out his entanglements, he would amaze the world as her tongue, her mouthpiece. At other times, Ma will let someone worship her for years until circumstances force that person to relinquish the bondage of Maya, and then she comes to him. It's all her play. End quote. To me, this is the essence of bhakti yoga, utilizing the fertile compost of the putrefaction of the soul's contents to elevate the lower realms of consciousness, much like in the alchemical process, which I also spend a lot of my time contemplating. First, of course, we have to do this with our own consciousness, and then, simply through the act of present awareness, we may attune others to a similar frequency, letting life become part of the act and the art of worship, and that art inspire others while also being food for God, Goddess. How interesting then to see such a bhakti conception and so many more in a book on Aghora. And what is Aghora, you may ask? It's not a simple answer, for any simple explanation is likely to bastardize this deep yogic tradition of contemplation and awakening through the act of worship of all aspects of the goddess. Nonetheless, I'll try. The Aghoris in India are the ones who you may have heard of or seen pictures of, much like wandering sadhus, but distinctly known for walking around with funeral ashes rubbed on their bodies. They walk with death, literally and figuratively, in an effort to peer through the eye of the needle and glimpse the totality. Some people focus with dismay on their tendency to meditate with the dead or their worship of the more wrathful forms of the goddess. But this is, again, only going to appear to be a dark obsession to the eyes of the novice, without context, and specifically without the context of a rich spirituality and deep sense of connection to the Divine Mother. Undoubtedly, however, Aghora is a particularly tricky form of yoga, due to its rather risky practices and work in the spirit realms, as well as being extremely easy to fall instead deeper into Maya due to the use of otherwise forbidden substances and practices. It's not something to take lightly. However, I share this more than just to bring light to the subject of Aghora itself, but to the recognition of the balance in all things, even in Tantra Yoga. And for most, the right-hand path of strict and pure practices is going to be much more accessible than this dangerous left-hand path. But in truth, we must find our balance on that razor's edge, overcoming fear even of the wrathful ones, to find the benefic deity who walks us home. The Aghori walks with death in life, in order to perceive truths that link the realms of life and the beyond in one continuum, with the understanding that life continues after death anyway. There's nothing more beautifully true, and yet this path is clearly not for everyone. For most, this path may appear only to be linked to the etymological relation of Aghora and the English word gory, a word us English speakers use most often on Halloween. While gory has other etymology, there's likely a correlation to Proto-Indo-European roots, and the word in Sanskrit being gora, which means terrific, frightful, horrible, awful, violent, and yet also venerable, among other things. It's spelled Ghora. Regardless, it's an uncanny similarity. The A in Aghora is the antithesis of, and so the Aghori is one who is fearless, unafraid of the terrible, violent, and particularly unafraid of the terrible, wrathful forms of the goddess, as Smashantara, the goddess of the smashan, or funeral grounds, the place where bodies would ultimately be cremated. Speaking of Halloween, we're just a few days out now from Halloween and the concomitant All Hallows Eve, Samhain, and El Dia de los Muertos celebrations. No doubt, around the world these holidays would be spent both in reverence for the ancestors and the power of death itself, as well as in morbid contemplation of death through various Halloween costumes and the obligatory horror films some watch. So, in a way, maybe Aghori isn't so out there after all. But what sets it apart, and what I would like to delve deeper into here, is the spiritual path, the literal bedrock of belief, which makes this tradition more than just a real-life horror flick. This is about transcendence, understanding the fear of death, and supposed totality of the death state, and coming to a place of absolute stillness within the mind and soul, standing on the razor's edge of life and death, mortal and immortal, hell and heaven, to realize that death is only another state of being. Hell is such an interesting word and concept. While the ideas of purgatory and the likes seem to have been popularized by Dante's Inferno, and of course the concept of a punitive hell realm came into view long before that, for much of the world there never was such a realm of punishment, but instead just a world of the dead. The word hell originally came from the Norse goddess Hel, Hel, and the realm of Helheim, which is not an actual realm of punishment, but essentially just an underworld, which is what many cultures believe in, simply a world of spirits. Of course, none of it sounds particularly fun, as these realms often were rather dark, and even the other realm of the dead in Norse mythos, Valhalla, which is reserved for those who die in battle, only sounds fun to those who are addicted to battle. To put it simply, many cultures make dying sound not so fun, simply by way of their macabre conditions, while only a select few put things into this heaven-hell dichotomy. Yet others, such as the Tibetan Buddhist conception, have a great amount of detail explaining the process of dying, in which one faces one's fears in the mirror of creation as the wrathful deities, eventually finding the peace and beauty of the benefic ones in all their splendor and the heavenly realms. It seems to me that what we fear most is not the dying part. It's the question of what lies beyond, and of course, in our darkest obsessions, characterized by the Dante's Inferno-based Catholic hegemony of fire and brimstone, hell-obsessed mythos. People for the past couple thousand years have never been more afraid of death, it may seem. Of course, belief structures that place importance on your actions in life, upon the trajectory of the soul at death, are not new to Catholicism. And it would seem that the placement of a god in the space of judgment at the soul at death may, in fact, have roots leading back to Egypt and likely numerous other ancient traditions. Nothing like a good dose of fear to bring one back to being a good citizen. But what do we really know about all this? I would say there are two potential sources of information, and both equally problematic to prove. One would be those who do, or claim to, remember the between-life state, and are either born with memories they share as children, or are awakened to it later in life. The other would be those who experience near death, but this concept can be wide-reaching range of experiences. What fascinates me about the stories shared today is that now that we have more and more near-deathers, also having verified proof of having died, literally being in the hospital or ambulance, verified as dead, sometimes for long periods of time, before spontaneously reviving or being revived, it certainly makes the experiences they have seem more verifiable. Of course, we don't know how much was of the brain versus the soul, or whether there is a point in death where brain activity ceases and yet experience continues. However, what we do know, and what I see again and again in people's stories, is that the vast majority, especially those who were truly dead and not just deep in a traumatic dissociation or partial dissociation from the body, have an experience of going home. My own partner and I had a near-death experience each, though his was a bit more revelatory than mine. And yet, interestingly enough, he didn't die. He had his experience in the air while being thrown from his motorcycle just prior to landing. He experienced being held by the mother at total peace and saw his life review in that split second, and was given the choice to stay or go. Choosing to stay, as life had been the blink of an eye in cosmic time so far, he landed on the pavement with, if I'm remembering correctly, barely more than a broken finger, maybe a clavicle. By all logic of the mind, he should not have lived, much less stood up and walked from the scene, much to the surprise of onlookers. To be held in this way is the ultimate dream of so many of us, even unconsciously. We seek to be held by a lover in this way. We even seek to be held by our religion in this way. And yet, in the end, it seems more and more clear to me that the experience people have is not lacking in religious luster. Some even claim to have seen Jesus. But it has a distinct homogeny in one aspect: love. Nearly every near-death experience I've read about, even those who had led what many would call a sinful life, they found a place of peace and universal love, held by the divine, even by ancestors and loved ones on the other side, as if they were being invited home. I suppose I should have mentioned a third option for verifying afterlife experiences, as there are a good many psychic mediums who seem to have an incredible ability to channel people's deceased loved ones with sometimes uncanny accuracy, and the resounding truth seems to be that these beloveds are in a place of peace. Of course, we can't know if this is just the best case scenario, but it helps to think that when we leave, we can look down on our loved ones and even communicate with them, watch them go through life, and witness their life events. It certainly helps to have these sort of affirmations of rebirth and or a peaceful afterlife, but to the Aghori and any sincere seeker, the proof is in the pudding. This is, for many, where prayer and mantra, spiritual practices, and yoga come in to take the reins and hopefully lead one down the path of direct experience, eventually even leading one to the remembrance of one's soul history and enlightenment. But let's back up a little bit. How does one really overcome the fear of death to attain these levels of consciousness? And does it really all come down to the fear of death, the fear of loss, or maybe grief work? When you spend a lifetime exploring death and sometimes feeling as if you're dying a little more each day, some things do begin to percolate into your everyday awareness. It doesn't happen overnight, just as enlightenment seems to be a long arc path for many, rather than a spontaneous awakening, though it's been known to happen. What I'm speaking of, though, is the arduous journey of the shadow, delving into all we fear the most for the sake of excavating it and coming to perhaps not an intellectual conclusion or even a fearless state of being, but a deeper acceptance, rather, of the realities and limitations of this world, in contrast to the expansive realities of the next. We also have to face our own proverbial shit. It isn't to say either, for the record, that this is the experience of all seekers or all chronically ill people or whatever else. I can only really speak to my own experiences, and I hope that they contain in them some of the more archetypal aspects that others can relate to on some level or another. That said, I find that each new layer of loss, each new flare of my illness, or layer peeled away or layer added, brings with it a lesson in surrender and acceptance, as well as deeper integrations of the lessons of my body itself, each part and cellular process being a blueprint and even a mythological structure for the unraveling of my spirit and psyche. In short, my body is the compass, and no matter what happens, it will lead me home, because death is the ultimate homecoming. And yet we grow attachments. My own attachment in this life is to my children above all else. Having been raised an orphan, I have a distinct desire not to see the same fate befall my children, and my deepest desire is to live to see them grow and prosper. At the same time, my health keeps me on my toes sometimes, and I have faced countless questions in my life of whether I should or would survive to see them grow up, or if life would even be worth living that long. Life has a way of giving us the exact lessons we need to further grow in our perceptive awareness, in ways which I would call new non-dual consciousness, to develop our spiritual faculties. For others, for whom enlightenment is not the express goal of their religion, perhaps we could simply say that the goal is becoming better. And somehow, however that particular intent should play out for us when we meet our Maker, has yet to be discovered. Death is the ultimate paradox. On one hand, you may find the answers you always sought. On the other, maybe you will no longer need them in the way you did on Earth. Better to just get it over with here and learn not to just be happy, but accepting of and able to aptly respond to whatever comes. Easier said than done, of course. They say that those of us who experience illness at a young age are the lucky ones. I would have to say on a spiritual level I may agree, or at least in the sense that we have opportunities for growth that others don't. I would also say that equally blessed are those who experience the illness or death of a loved one when they're young. I was triple blessed, I guess. The fact is, as we find our way through life, it's easy, even for the triple blessed, to lose touch with the profundity of awareness necessary to keep one's feet well grounded in the present moment. It's all too easy to get lost in the realms of desire and disappointment, or the future seeking or past regretting, and even those of us who live with a chronic state of reminder of our mortality and limitations find ways to trick ourselves into a new normal, which somehow takes the gravity from the situation and helps it back into a state of daily humdrum that may even give room for more desire and disappointment, thus delaying our ultimate aha moment of acceptance and present-mindedness, which we can only hope and assume is the true purpose of this fragile mortal coil in the first place. I suppose this is why some, such as the Aghoras, may defer to more extreme measures, such as praying to Tara in a cemetery with a dead body, to try to step into the state of disorder that's necessary for finding a new order. In other words, sometimes we need a true shocker to get ourselves out of ordinary awareness. And if you have yet to lose a loved one, or perhaps have loosened your grip on the material attachments just enough that you don't have any loved ones you fear losing, then I suppose a solid dose of death therapy in a cemetery might do the trick. Of course, what they would tell you is that perhaps when they've had enough lifetimes of chanting the same mantra, the goddess herself would visit you, due to a combination of your diligence and her grace, deliver you from your ignorance. However it goes down, there's no doubt to me that something in these practices is an attempt at helping the yogi get out of his own way long enough to let grace do its work. In fact, it may be, as many allude to, that grace is always there waiting, and we're the ones who occlude our own vision from being able to see what's already in front of us. But as I mentioned before, maybe we do so for the sake of bhakti, for the sake of remaining here in this mortal coil just a little bit longer, and not only delivering souls, if one is to believe that one can be that helpful eventually, but also to bring greater beauty to God in the act of our cycles of sleep and heartfelt revelation. Maybe, just maybe, our lives are art, and some of us are addicted to the act of creating beauty for the divine, with all our sordid sufferings and awakenings, longing and finding. This to me is the heart of bhakti. And if someone along my way should be so inspired by my own longing songs as to find their own, then wonderful. My work has also served God in some way then. Maybe that person will even surpass me on the path. If we come to terms, I mean really come to terms with death, we must also come to terms with the true formless nature of the self. We're not what role we play, the body we exist in. We are malleable and formlessness itself in our true nature. We must come to terms with Maya, the illusion, and cleave ourselves to Ma, she who transcends the illusory world. Death, in the form of Ma, will give you the entire world eventually, in order to be sure that you have no desires left. Only then will you begin to glimpse the reality of what you desire, which is simply to walk with her in all your days. I may upset some by saying this, but I don't see any one deity as being one that we must worship. In fact, ultimately, we cannot disrespect what we don't understand, just as a child cannot insult with words they don't truly understand. God and Goddess, Father and Mother, Shiva and Shakti, primordial he and she, exist beyond our fettered minds in complete grasping and understanding. We're simply given as much as we need to continue to grow in our understanding, life after life. Even if we're given glimpses of our past lives, it's only for the sake of continuing our growth and understanding of self. As Svoboda puts it, Ma taught me well. She let me know about some of my previous births, the ones that mattered most to my present existence, but she didn't want me to learn everything at once. For a play to be well acted, sometimes it's better that the actors have no idea of what they're doing. In this way, they can act out their parts with greater spontaneity and feeling. When you do know who you are, it changes everything. So again, we come back to this concept of being partially cloaked in Maya, the path, perhaps, of the Bodhisattva. No matter how or when we awaken fully, the time of our awakening, as that of our death, is preordained. At least that's the conception of the Vedas. So, if one is to try this belief on for size with me here, if death is inevitable, we're already dead. Our death fate is already sealed, and as such, the manner in which we live and die is the only thing we have control over, if that. Not that we can control what kills us per se, but rather the presence of mind we have that when we do, to not be afraid, to accept and not fear anything which we may see. As Svoboda writes, quote, "The sight of Mahakala, Shiva as destroyer or death, is so terrible that even God incarnate quails before him. Even Jesus had a moment on the cross when his faith almost failed him. Of course, the sight of Mahakala is not terrible, it is wonderful, but the ego sees him as terrible because he's come to rip her away from all her attachments, and some attachments go very deep. When she is free, she realizes who she is and who Mahakala is. To remain alert at the moment of death is the achievement of a lifetime. People think death is to be feared. It isn't so. Birth is to be feared because when you're born, you forget all about what you did in your past lives and you go out and ruin yourself. But death is release from your physical shackles. When Shiva comes to take someone, he is very gentle, especially to innocent and harmless people. And children, how he hates to take children. He'll do almost anything for a child just so it won't feel any fear, just so he can release it from its suffering." End quote. Of course, in this quote, when he says, when she is free, she realizes who she is and who Mahakala is. He's referring to she, ripping her away from her attachments. Who is her? He's referring to Maya, the aspect of the goddess, which is the illusory nature itself. So Maya is just another face of Ma, of Shakti. So how do we remain conscious even in death? How do we remain alert, unafraid, if not through the practice of dying each and every day? In my heart of hearts, I believe this is not the same as totally dissociating from life and from human connection. It is only to learn the art of accepting that if we truly are one, there is ultimately no separation possible from those we love, no death which can lead us away from the ultimate awakening of all beings to the same unified reality. We may gain comfort from stories of people who found their loved ones on the other side, but even this is incomplete because all these souls will continue to cycle in samsara until they can fully learn to integrate this truth. But we may find more lasting comfort in knowing that we can be part of the growth of this family of souls, or better yet, to know that ultimately we are truly all one. There is no other, and no liberation without non-dual awareness, or as Svoboda says it, there is no mukti, freedom from delusion, without bhukti, enjoyment. Enjoyment refers to the acceptance of all phenomena which may occur to an individual, be they good, enjoyable, or bad, painful. The aspirant relies on the magnanimity of nature, personified as the deity, to protect and provide. This reminds me, as a little side note here, of my own experience of this oneness when I was very young, right after my parents died. And I think it's not really surprising that that's the timing in which this took place, but I also was barely 4 years old. And one night I started to see and feel myself leave my body. I felt myself floating like in a circle, like floating out by my feet. And I saw it as my bed, like rotating in space. And then all of a sudden I was out among the stars. I was in space. And I was a filament of light going in and out through the middle of this giant ball of light, this star. And I could see the other stars around. I could see that I was in space. And I was part of this star, this oneness, this consciousness. It was pure consciousness and bliss. To me, this is the ultimate truth of who we are. I was given this awareness at a young age, which, it's been hard for me to always maintain, but it's something that I am always able to return to and remember that this is my true nature. This is our true nature. We are one, and we all, in my opinion, when we die or whatever else, pass into different realms of consciousness, we are able to join back with that oneness that we really are. And we can experience ourselves as separate, just like that individual filament of light. But our true nature is the whole totality of the star itself. So, all of this is fine and wonderful, but the truth is, for many of us, full-on enlightenment, full-on, awareness of that oneness within our life may not happen in this life. And yet, death is the ultimate opportunity for awakening, or at the very least, for immense progress on the spiritual path. As I alluded to before, contemplating death has, for some of my life, been both an emotionally reactionary response to suffering that felt too immense to bear, while also being a huge aspect of my spiritual path. The thing that makes it lean more towards the latter is the way in which my spirituality has, in fact, been more deeply organized by my stubborn clinging to life in spite of suffering. In other words, I know that with each choice I make to remain in spite of it all, I will unlock a deeper sense of what I'm truly longing for. And more intricate and rewarding lessons reveal themselves through every step in which I ultimately lean in and accept the pain as teacher, the karma as guide rather than enemy. Remember Svoboda's words. She wanted to entangle him partially in her Maya and then to save him, so that while he was working out his entanglements, he would amaze the world as her tongue, her mouthpiece. So yes, every karma has its potential usefulness, for in the unraveling we have the opportunity to create an even more refined art of bhakti, using our divine longing as fuel for our own funeral pyre, upon which our souls burn and returns like the phoenix in even more splendor. So many so-called spiritual traditions seem to lean us away from that which they would call sin, away from karma, away from anything which is deemed too dark, distracting, negative, and rough. And yet it is this very rough surface which we brush up against in infinite moments of friction, which polishes our souls into something magnificent, something that brings more beauty to the table, upon which the gods, or God, however you see it, sup in their infinite in-breath, as they retrieve the return on their investment in the material world of illusory separation. It's our beauty, our revelation, which makes it all worthwhile to create Maya in the first place. The belief in karma, or sin, as the enemy seems most of all prevalent in the Christian tradition. Yet I would like to offer an alternative conception, one which is corroborated by some of the Gnostic Gospels, such as the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. In the Gospel it says, "The teacher, Jesus, answered, 'There is no sin. It is you who makes sin exist. When you act according to the habits of your corrupted nature, this is where sin lies.'" There are many interpretations of these words, but my own inner sense has always said the same. As I say in a song of my own, "In my deep knowing I do see the sleeping children, blinded to the mystery, believing in sin. Flowering I hold the truth beyond conception. When someone is trying to trick you to take, all you hear is wisdom, the true in the fake. I hear the suffering ones, may we always remember, One step beyond letting go, there lies love. In other words, sin is a belief structure. This world is not built upon sin, only on a separation from the true nature that we all have. When this nature has become corrupted, as they say in that, interpretation of the gospel, we may fall away from it, experiencing an illusion of sin, of separation consciousness, of other. As Jean-Yves Leloup says in his interpretation of that passage from the Gospel of Mary, the dramatic sin of the contemporary world is its relativizing of the absolute and its absolutizing of the relative. We're born into this existence in which we have this profound sense of lack, of longing. For the mystic, this longing is elevated into a spiritual longing, rather than misconstrued as a material one, and yet the lack still remains. Until one realizes the truth, beyond all conceptions, beyond all words and religions and ideologies which can only point the way but are not the way. As Meister Eckhart, a Christian metaphysician, said, "If you do nothing, truly nothing, God cannot help but come into you. If you leave, God can enter." In other words, one step beyond letting go, there lies love, with a capital L. The Gospel of Mary continues, "This is why the good has come into your midst. It acts together with the elements of your nature, so as to reunite it with its roots." Then he continued, "This is why you become sick and why you die. It is a result of your actions. What you do takes you further away. Those who have ears, let them hear." As Leloup further postulates on the above words from the original Gospel of Mary, quote, "Sickness, suffering, and death are the consequences of our acts. There is no one to blame for this, and it is vain to complain and expostulate about the evil nature of matter, the world, and humanity. There is no room here for hatred of the world, for it has been clearly stated that there is no sin, no evil. Evil and sin arise from the blamer in ourselves. It is interesting to note that in their exegesis of Revelation, some of the desert fathers of early Christianity saw the sign of deliverance in this teaching of no blame or accusation of others. They say, quote, "He is dead, the blamer of our brothers," they said. This blamer is the Shaitan, or obstacle in Hebrew, the diablos, or divider in Greek, in us. When he is dead and there is no longer a place for him in us, we are free. The slave, the victim, and therefore the blamer of circumstances is dead in us because it is no longer fed. It is replaced by the living, symbolized as the Son of God, who takes all responsibility for what happens. We cease to accuse others or ourselves and instead begin to observe the pattern of causes and effects that have led to this state of sickness, suffering, and death." End quote. This treatise on death, it seems, is not just about death after all, but about life, about everything, about the way that we live and the way that we die. We cannot expect to die well if we have not lived well, and we cannot expect to live well if we do not intend to die well. The two are inextricably interwoven, but also neither can be transcended without the other. There's one line from my above song, which even for me always grabs my attention, as if it wants to unravel further for me to fully grasp the meaning of my own words. "When someone is trying to trick you to take, all you hear is wisdom, the true in the fake." I can't help but wonder Is this what the masters had in mind when they tell us it's you who make sin exist? In the Krishna consciousness movement, there's one premise which I hear passed around a lot. Based upon these experiences people have had sitting at the feet of masters of bhakti yoga who were immersed heart, mind, and soul in Krishna. In this conception, the bhakti master, who is immersed continually in prema bhakti, sees Krishna in everything, all the time. That is, even the darkness, even the shadow or corrupted places in our world would also be Krishna, the Leela or playtime of Krishna. The separation, longing, chase, and the reunification of parts of the whole are all part and parcel of his love affair, his and hers, to be precise. The dance of mother and father, Shiva and Shakti, the dance of divine, magnetic, and electric poles of creation found within everything. I will never forget the day I woke up in my home in Hawaii shortly after my first child was born. My eyes already resting on a poster I had on my wall of Radha and Krishna, sitting in the forest of Vrindavan upon an Indian couch, surrounded by jungle and birds, and looking at one another with this particular mood. Radha, Krishna's consort, was hiding part of her face behind her veil, peering at him in this coy, lovesick fashion, with tears running down her face, while Krishna reached toward her, peacock feather in his turban, with tears of ecstasy running down his face as well. There they sit in this snapshot of eternity, exquisitely painted by the incredible Shamarani. In this moment, there in the early morning in Hawaii, 2 geckos had made their way into the house. God only knows how, because we were in a fairly tight house, and the male and female gecko were on their respective sides of the painting, dancing just as Radha and Krishna in their Leela. The female gecko did her slow, coy dance of submission, turning away just so at this angle that reminded me precisely of the mood depicted of Radha, hiding behind her veil, while the male gecko in true Krishna peacock form showed his brilliance to her, showing his back, beckoning to her. This went on in this slow, subtle, barely moving dance where they stayed on their respective quadrants of the painting for no less than 20 or 30 minutes, while I looked on in amazement, until finally something shifted in the mood and off they ran together, no doubt to mate somewhere else in my house. If Krishna Leela can be found even in the geckos, surely it's also found in the shadow, in the wars, in the darkness, in our karmas, and not just in the things of light. Death is the final frontier for some, but in truth it may be only the next great adventure, as Gandalf said. At best, it may be the doorway to enlightenment, which a well-ordered mind, in Gandalf's words, may be able to walk through with the utmost calm and presence of mind. Not the mind of the brain, mind you, but the mind of the spiritual heart. At worst, it may be simply another step in a long, beautiful, arduous, incredibly nuanced path toward the one, which we may enjoy just a little longer, the illusion of our separation, if nothing else for the sake of cultivating even more exquisite beauty to offer at the feet of the divine. Maybe you aren't fully awake yet, because God knows you can make even more brilliant art of your awakening, if you just collect a little more refinement and ingredients for this delicious meal that you're preparing. And maybe you're also meant to share a bit of the bounty along the way with other weary travelers, even if it means you delay your own travel a bit. There are infinite paths back to God, some complex, some more direct, some logical, and the result of practices done for lifetimes, some more feminine and winding and ultimately arrived at in a flash of intuitive brilliance. What I would like to propose to my listeners today is this. Death is the ultimate threshold of initiation, not an end to the initiatory passage of life, but a crescendo in a longer story song, weaving its way through lifetimes and entire worlds, maybe even multiverses of experiences, before we finally arrive at that shore of the infinite, whole and holy, weeping in ecstasy as Radha and Krishna do in their eye-gazing dance of longing and surrender. For you, death may be a passage to the next birth, a birth that may contain immense suffering and joy and no doubt lessons upon lessons, but it may also be a passage into the stillness of knowing, a passage into wholeness and belonging, and the transcendental awareness necessary to take your own spiritual journey to a new level, which hopefully, if you're so lucky, will loop you back around again anyway to be of service in the lower worlds to those still suffering in the illusion of sin and separation. I sincerely pray for each and every one of us that at the moment of death, it be a realization of surrender, which can bring us to the latter possibility. May we reach into the depths of our immense souls during life to face the fear, the heartache, the confusion, and the attachments of our soul's karmic bandhas, and loosen their grip, slowly but surely, to arrive back home in one piece. Peace be with you. I hope you've all enjoyed today's deep dive into some pretty dark territory, pretty intense territory. The quotes today that I mentioned largely were from the book Aghora, At the Left Hand of God by Robert E. Swoboda. He also has a second book about Aghora. And from the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and the translation and purport by Jean-Yves Leloup. And if you are interested in following me, you can find me on Instagram under nectar.b.alchemy. That's nectar.bee.alchemy. And follow me there and take a look at my website at www.nourishwellnesswithin.com. I hope that we can do this again soon. This was a really deep one, and it's definitely not the last that I will be doing about death, because birth and death are two of those portals that I, that are simply the biggest portals of life. But, as a birth worker and as someone that has danced a lot with death, these are, definitely some core themes. But we will also be delving into infinite other forms of initiation and threshold work in this podcast, Ananta as well. Have a wonderful Samhain, everybody, and take care until next time.